Well, welcome everybody to Home on the Hill psychoeducational program. My name is Joni Delberg and I am your facilitator today. I'm the family life educator and facilitator and navigator for Home on the Hill. And I'd like to welcome you today. So before I begin, I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight, Dr. Sean Kidd, who I have, and I don't know if he remembers, but I've been to many focus groups and some of the research projects that you've done in the past. And I've been very involved at CAMH and in some of the research projects that have been taking place over the years, also with my son as well. So Dr. Sean Kidd, he has grown up in Brampton. He went to Carleton for undergrad, and he went also to Yale for a postdoctoral. Dr. Sean Kidd is a clinical psychologist, senior scientist, and the division chief of psychology at the Center of Addiction and Mental Health, and associate professor in the University of Toronto Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Sean Kidd's focus has included developing and trial interventions for individuals with severe mental illness and youth who have experienced homelessness. His research has included trials of cognition and critical time interventions for schizophrenia spectrum populations, housing stabilization and interventions for homeless youth, digital health interventions for severe mental illness, and global health work in the area of climate change and homelessness. And I have to say, while I waited for my meeting today, I read a lot of your papers. Very impressive. You've done a lot of work.
That's very kind of you. Thanks.
So tonight's topic is going to be technology-driven supports for people with psychosis. So this talk will address how technology has and is being used to support the treatment and well-being of populations with psychosis and their key supports. A particular concentration will be upon digital health tools used on smartphones. And this will be the field of the future. So this is very important research, and the technology is really developing quite quickly. So I would like to introduce Sean, and I'm going to make you the host. Thank you for doing the presentation for us. I know you're a busy man.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's fine.
Okay.
It's great to be here, and nice to see this group. So I'll just walk you through, before getting into slides and things, a little bit about what I was hoping to cover and how this evening would go. So what I'm hoping to do is do a fairly quick world tour of how technology has been used to treat, engage, work with, provide supports for people with severe mental health challenges such as schizophrenia, and spend a little bit more time on probably the most active area related to digital health, which is technologies that exist on people's smartphones and that are related to everything from self-help through to helping people connect with clinicians. And while psychosis is the focus here, it certainly has relevance to other severe mental health challenges, and I'll address that a bit too. I'm going to try and aim to talk do the didactic, me just talking bit, just maybe for 40 minutes, 45 minutes. I kind of get tired of the sound of my own voice fairly quickly. And then we'll drop slides, and then it would be nice to just have a conversation with you all about, any questions you have, of course, but then to hear about your experiences if you've had some in this area, and then ideas too, because this is certainly an area that's in as much as we might think it's well underway. These are very early days in many ways in terms of how these technologies are being used in care environments and otherwise. So I'm hoping that sounds like a reasonable plan. And so with that, I will kick off things, share my screen, go through some slides and a bit of a talk, and then we can have a conversation, which I look forward to. So so I've kind of covered this, I think. Just a few acknowledgements and disclosures. So the work I'm going to describe has been a pretty intensively supported and extensively supported by CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health here in Toronto, the CAMH Foundation. And we've also had funding, I should acknowledge, from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And we're kind of, I'll get into what this collaboration is, because we're kind of a cast of folks behind this. And I certainly might not even be the most important person involved in this work. It's many people involved. And so we have folks involved from a digital health company, an industry partner called Memetext. Amos Adler is their CEO, and Wenjia Zhao is their technology development guru. On the CAMH side, we have folks from our technology transfer office. They kind of manage when we work at the hospital, when we work with industry partners. The tech transfer office helps build relationships, contracts, and tries to kind of manage how a public sector organization like CAMH works with a private sector organization, which, as you might imagine, can have some complexity. So we're very grateful to have them involved. And so that's Claire Wisniewski, Biba Ghoshal, and then some other folks, a few other scientists, Quan McKenzie, Aristotle Vaneskis, and a very smart grad student who's been along for the ride for quite a while, Jess Darcy. And some disclosures. So A4I, which is one of the technologies I'll spend a bit of time on here, is sort of new territory for CAMH. It's a joint venture, so it's a company as well as being a technology that is jointly owned by CAMH and Memetext, and a small amount of the company is owned by myself. And so there is a financial interest there that I need to disclose in any presentation. I've certainly not ordered my first yacht or have had many calls from Bill Gates. We've not made any money. Maybe we never will, but it is important to disclose this because as we talk about that part of what we're doing. But I am going to start off with spending time on technologies and approaches that I've been less involved in. And so what I'm hoping to do, because I don't know where you all are at in terms of digital health and understanding what's going on. I know we all probably have heard of, the many technologies, some of the most famous ones like Headspace and Luminosity and that kind of thing. And then some of you maybe will be far more familiar, but I'm hoping to cover some of the context, give the example of A4I, talk about opportunities and challenges, and hopefully it will be interesting for you to hear a little bit of an insider perspective as a person that's been involved in trying to develop and commercialize and build out a digital health technology, is kind of some of the stuff that we go through trying to do that. And I can't say that we've arrived necessarily. We still have a long road ahead of us, but hopefully you'll leave this a little bit better informed as to what goes into that effort. So first off, as with all I think good presentations, it's good to start with a story before getting into lots kind of facts and figures and information. So at CAMH, most of my time is research. So I build clinical trials, develop interventions for young people experiencing homelessness. That's a big chunk of my time, working with organizations like Covenant House and Loft and Wellesley Institute and so on. And I've done quite a few trials in the area of schizophrenia, community-based interventions, climate change. I have too many interests, you could probably tell. But I do spend a small portion of my time doing direct clinical service, because for me, it's quite important. Alongside, I'm the division chief too, so I do some leadership stuff at CAMH, administrative stuff, but it's important for me personally to have a hand in still seeing people directly, because it helps keep me grounded and keep me in touch with what people are going through. So in my small bit of practice, I see a range of folks, and I see folks with everything from milder anxiety and those kinds of challenges, which are much more common, right on through to people struggling with illnesses like addictions and schizophrenia. And so for a few years, I saw this young man, and this might be a familiar story, but he's a young guy, he's in his 20s, and the medicines he was taking, his antipsychotic medications, sadly weren't really covering everything in terms of his psychosis. He has schizophrenia. And while his medications took the edge off, he was able to stay grounded, not be so lost in delusions that he couldn't look after himself. He still had terrible auditory hallucinations, voices saying scary things all the time. And it was a struggle for him. And so a large part of our work involved trying to help him be better able to label what is a voice, label what's a delusion, and put that in a certain place, and then be able to bring his attention back to, a more grounded place and focus on things like, the business he was trying to create and being better connected socially and so on. Kind of the sort of usual sort of stuff you do working with somebody with schizophrenia. And he would regularly bring in his smartphone. He had an Android device, nothing fancy. And he would try to use native apps in his phone. By native apps, I mean the apps everyone gets when you get any phone. He'd use a recorder, record the environment in his apartment building, and play it for me in a session and say, hey, do you hear voices here? He's trying to use his recorder on his phone to parse out, is that someone yelling in the hallway, or is it a hallucination? He was trying to schedule things. He was just trying to make his phone useful for his illness. And around the time that I was working with this guy, I just finished a systematic review of apps for anxiety and depression for young people. And at the time, this is 5 or 6 years ago, there's about 2,000 mobile apps for that. Probably now there are 5 or 10 times as many. But the message here is that if you have milder anxiety, depression, you've got thousands of options. So I thought there's got to be something. It's got to be a technology available for a guy like this with a severe mental health challenge. I mean, if you like the sound of crinkling paper, you can find an app for that. So there's got to be something for him. But it was very frustrating to find there was nothing at the time. Even to this day, there's not much, but there was truly nothing at the time to support a person with psychosis. There was, a few symptom checkers, mostly for clinicians, but nothing for him. And that's frustrating. And I always kind of have an ear out and an eye out for things that might reflect a degree of stigma. And I think part of the reason why there's nothing is probably some assumptions out there that people with schizophrenia might not use a technology like that, which I knew from my clinical trials where loads of people and increasingly were using smartphones. From his example, that many people had phones and wanted to use them for their illness self-management, but they couldn't have access. So that began the journey here. At the time, certainly I don't have a Facebook profile. I don't even have a Twitter account. I'm certainly not a technology connected person. But I became interested in seeing how we could make use of technology to help folks like him manage his illness and stay better connected with providers. And that's sort of the start of the journey. So I'm going to come back to that and come back to these kinds of tools. But first, I thought I would cover a little bit of the history and the context so that you can kind of place something like a technology on a smartphone in a context and in a history. So, and I think, I don't know everyone on this call, certainly, but imagine many of you or all of you probably have had extensive connections through family and otherwise with our service sector here in mental health. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but of course, we know that we are in a context with quite challenged engagement. We have a really tough time engaging with people effectively and productively and sustaining that engagement. We get a lot of folks dropping out of treatment plans and dropping out of connection with clinicians. So it's a challenge. And the biggest part of this challenge is a fundamental underfunding of our mental health service sector. We are just not funded to provide all of the evidence-based interventions and tools and do the engagement that we could if we were. So it's a challenge context. And one of the areas where we have particular challenge, we've got a lot of resource dedicated to crisis, so emergency rooms and inpatient units. But when people leave those crisis and very intensive support environments, that's where we kind of tend to fall off in terms of supporting people and managing their own illness. Just like if a person has diabetes or an allergy and any illness where we need medicines, but also a set of tools, education, and supports to manage our illness effectively. And that's where we have some challenges, and we can't do the outreach, we can't do the one-to-one support, the groups, all of those things that people need. And something like cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis has a good evidence base. People want to access it, but the challenge is that in practice and in reality, only about 3 or 4% of people with psychosis actually get CBT for psychosis. So this is a challenge that we face: an underfunded system, and where we have some pretty serious limitations in terms of what we can offer. This plays out in terms of outcomes. We see folks struggling and often in cycles of crisis service use of kind of going through the ER, spending time on inpatient units, out to the community, and then making that cycle. And of course, that cycle has major implications in the lives of those affected. Outcomes can be challenged. So inequitable access to resources, And this is where we see, folks that have the advantage of perhaps financial means, very supportive families, those sorts of things, and as well as maybe don't struggle with systemic inequities such as Indigenous populations and racialized populations. We see the challenges kind of spread out in inequitable ways. So this is the context. Not going to go to town on that. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. And now looking at mental health tech, and this is a huge area. I mentioned already that there are, and you're probably aware, there are thousands and thousands of apps and digital health approaches in terms of mental health, more broadly in healthcare generally. It's an enormous area, and there are many people building these technologies. But the challenges are, and these are really significant challenges, there are two areas where we run into real issues. So one is evidence. Evidence, by that I mean, do these things work? Do they do what they purport to do? Are they effective? Do they help people? And you need to spend a lot of time building evidence around that to prove that. And probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 5%, less than 5% of all these technologies are out there have any kind of evidence that they work. And so this is a major challenge. And it's a challenge in mental health because a person with a mental health challenge only has so much time and attention and energy to put into their recovery path and the work they need to do in the area of recovery. And it's an awful shame if some of that time, energy, and interest is taken up with something that we know isn't really very helpful. And the second major problem is uptake. We can have technologies that in theory work, but people either can't access them, can't find them, or somehow they just don't work in a person's lived environment. So those are some major hurdles in this area. So you've got many thousands of approaches. Very, very few have shown evidence of effectiveness and decent uptake. Now, backing way up, like we can get thinking that digital health is something that, is a new thing or something that's happened this century. But that's absolutely not the case. So telepsychiatry, which some of you might have heard of, has been around as early as the 1950s, so a long time. And basically, telepsychiatry has taken, it still exists, it's still very active, but it's basically where you set up some video cameras and you stream in real time. And it often will be particularly relevant in rural environments where you might have a terrible time accessing a psychiatrist, but where a nurse or a support person might bring a person to a video room, and they can have in that room a conversation and get an assessment done with a clinician, usually a psychiatrist, who could do an interview, who could do an assessment, provide some recommendations. Then the local GP or the local nurse can act on those recommendations. That's essentially telepsychiatry. Still happens to this day at CAMH. We have telepsychiatry rooms at CAMH, and they're all over the place. And the evidence is pretty good. Providers tend to have reservations about it, saying, "Oh, I don't know if I can do this as well, and I'm not sure if this is going to work." But end users or service users actually like them. It tends to have decent outcomes and is feasible. There's not much in terms of specific in the evidence in terms of psychosis specifically, but this is an approach that's used extensively with people with more severe mental health challenges. Psychotherapies, now we're getting a lot more contemporary. There are many different approaches to this. Like a major one in Ontario, you might have heard of Mind Beacon, but there are many of these models and platforms that are out there. They might be synchronous, asynchronous. By that I mean they facilitate actual direct contact with a therapist or support person. Some of them are asynchronous. They give you tools to use and you can have a chat or email exchange, but they facilitate interactions with a therapist one way or another. The promising outcomes, the challenges with psychotherapies, and these are pretty significant challenges, are related to sustained gains. So when a person is not engaged in it, in the psychotherapy, do the gains, are they sustained? A big challenge is attrition. What you tend to see with many of these platforms is a really good uptake for the first session or two, but a big drop off. People don't stick with it. Particularly with adolescents. So psychosis is starting to come along in this area, but so it's promising. And there are large investments in it, and it's good to explore, but there's still a lot of work to do, particularly on the attrition end. So you get people connected, it's accessible. In Ontario, there are pathways to getting it for free, but how can we make this something that people don't just go to it for a time or two and then disappear? Virtual reality. So this is something that you probably will have heard of as well. It has in the area of severe mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, it has been tested and has been used a fair bit and increasingly. So virtual reality, you put on the headset and you're basically given a screen where you kind of move through a virtual world. It's very popular with video games and the like. And it's become much more accessible. So it used to be you have to go to this special room, special environment with a huge headset, very, very expensive. But now they actually have cardboard headsets you can put on. You can squeeze your cell phone in there, and basically you've got VR happening. So it's become much, much cheaper, much more accessible. And people are looking at VR for assessment and treatment. Assessment has particular implications in terms of things like social functioning. A person's, rather than like the typical old school neuropsych way of assessing social functioning, is you get pictures of faces and you have to tell the assessor what emotion is that face expressing. And you might say, oh, it looks like an angry face, or it looks like a sad face, or confused, or what have you. But with virtual reality, you have an opportunity to see how people react to and respond to and interpret social environments virtually. And this is really important in schizophrenia, where this is both an area where you want to understand what's going on, but then also opportunities for treatment. And there's a guy named George Fusius at CAMH, a psychiatrist, who's doing great work in this area. So it's another technology area. Education. So there are many different platforms that have come up to try and educate, make people more aware about schizophrenia and psychosis. There are video game based approaches to engage young people, to help them look at what's going on with them and try and engage, and all in the interest of promoting early intervention and people seeking help. Because of course we know the earlier people seek help, the better they will do. My colleague, Suzanne Archie, out at McMaster, she's done a great job of building a tool in this area, and there are other areas too. So trying, like, a key part of managing one's own illness, doesn't matter if it's schizophrenia or an allergy, is knowing what's going on, knowing what the signs and symptoms are, and knowing what you need to do. And so this is a way of doing that. Like, I think we've all probably had that experience of a physician telling us rapid fire in a clinic, you need to do this, this, and this is what's going on, bing, bang, boom, and then you're out the door and you're trying to remember what the heck they said, and you maybe remember even less 2 months later. So here are opportunities to keep people better engaged and understanding what's going on. Cognitive remediation. This is another area there's quite a bit of activity. So of course, with an illness like schizophrenia, people can often have substantial cognitive challenges. When I say cognitive, I mean attention and memory and problem solving. And so one way, when I first was in undergrad and in grad school many years ago, we tended to see our brains like a hard drive on a computer. That's something that you've got when you're born and you get going after adolescence. You've got what you've got, and generally speaking, over the years, you tend to just lose. It's it's not the greatest story in terms of aging, but what we've come to understand is our brains have much more plasticity than we used to think. By that, I mean that our brains continue to grow and develop depending on our experiences. And why that's important here is that if you have cognitive challenges, with practice, just like doing push-ups and sit-ups, you can strengthen your cognitive abilities. And so many different platforms have come out on this. A couple relevant to schizophrenia in particular, CogPack, Happy Neuron's quite a good one. But what these programs have done, when you can engage people with schizophrenia, go through a period of using these technologies, and importantly, trying to transfer it into their real world. I mean, if it's only a computer game you're playing, it's not harmful. But playing Angry Birds, you only get better at Angry Birds. It doesn't help you with dating or with your job. So the key thing is you've got to try and translate maybe an improved attention and memory and so on, and translate that into real world and relevant activities. And so that's why cognitive mediation actually requires quite an intensive intervention, but the outcomes are good. I've done trials of this myself, and we've seen better outcomes in education environments and community functioning and the like, and sustained gains. So it's quite promising. It does have a technology base. They're mostly games and practice based in computers. And so that is another technology. So circling back to apps that live on people's phones, and to talk a little bit about, I think I've covered this to some extent, but why do they fail? I mean, we've all apps are certainly like, they're the exercise bike of the 21st century, right? Is we've all probably picked up apps. Oh, this is kind of cool. You use it for a week or two and then kind of forget about it. I know I've done that many times, even though I know they're good for me. And I know I'd probably be a better, more mindful and this and that and the other person if I use this thing every day. I just it drops off. So the first problem is that they don't work, and the second problem is they aren't sustainable. But the main one is you have geniuses building these things. You've got, like, my goal in this, I don't want to build a technology personally that maybe is great, magical, and effective and all that, but only 25 people ever use. I mean, that's not worth it. So if you want thousands and thousands of people to access what you build, and that's what I want to do, you have to commercialize, because it's quite an elaborate, expensive, and complex endeavor to get a technology in the hands of many thousands of people. And I'll get into our journey on that. But a big part of that is you've got to build a business or an approach around it. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a for-profit business, as it can be facilitated through government purchasing and supporting and making available. But you've got to have a structure to get the technology in the hands of many people. And in the instance of schizophrenia, this isn't a technology that's going to be widely picked up by folks, in the vein of Headspace or something, where people will just go on the app store. Hey, this looks great. I've seen commercials. I'll get this. This is something that's going to have to flow through clinical environments, and that's where a large part of our effort is. And that's where most health apps fail, is not so much on effects or design, but it really is they failed to find a way to get it out into clinical spaces and get it into people's hands. Okay, so heading into psychosis, and I'm kind of about halfway. Let's give you a heads up, because again, I mentioned that I get tired of the sound of my own voice, and that's starting to flicker a little bit. So, and it's a Wednesday evening, and I know you've probably had a long day too. So I promise I'm not going to spend too much longer just talking at you. So in psychosis, there are a few things have been tried. A woman who's I personally think is a really impressive person, named Pat Deegan. She's also a psychologist, and I had the privilege of meeting her one time in Kansas City, and she's just just an amazing person, an advocate. She has schizophrenia and had a really troubled path in early life, and has really become a person who's had major impacts in the area of mental health reform. But she built a technology called Common Ground, and what she was trying to do, and I think she's morphed this in recent years, but certainly initially she tried to build an in-office technology. And basically what it involved is quite clever and smart, is that a person would go into a clinic, and while you're waiting around to get in to see your psychiatrist, you go to a computer terminal, you'd hear some recovery stories from some other folks with challenges perhaps similar to your own. You'd answer some questions about what's been going on with you, about risk, about your goals and whatnot. And then a summary of all that goes into your psychiatrist. You go meet your psychiatrist, and they've got a bit of a profile or a breakdown that helps them with their assessment and helps engage you in treatment planning. And it's a great concept. And I saw it demonstrated in Kansas City, as I mentioned, and I went back, this is years ago, gosh, nearly 15 years ago now, but went back to St. Joe's in Hamilton and was excited about this and laid this out for senior administrators. And the immediate question was, okay, so you need how much space in waiting rooms, and what technology needs to be put in, and how many computers? And before you know it, the price tag was up into the millions. And then in our resource-strapped environment, suddenly that's not on the table. So it was a good idea, but it's challenging to implement, quite expensive. People have tried websites for different things, to engage people, to collect data, to educate. Attrition's a problem and engagement's a problem. So mobile health approaches, and by that I mean mobile phones, smartphones mostly, they're the most explored. So that's what we're going to get into next. Now, one of the most common things I get asked or told is, people with schizophrenia, do they even have phones, smartphones, and will they use it? Will they be paranoid about, these kind of, a lot of assumptions, some of which have a hint or sometimes more than a hint of some stigmatizing assumptions about people with schizophrenia. But it's absolutely wrong. Recent surveys are up to around 80+% of people with a diagnosis in the schizophrenia spectrum have a smartphone of some kind. It might not be bells and whistles, but it's at least a smartphone. And the vast majority of those 80 to 90% of those folks want to use their phones in terms of their healthcare, to use them for managing their illness and engaging with providers. So the phones are there, they're in people's hands, they want to use them for their care. And so this is great. And it also dispels the notion that that these kinds of technologies are not relevant in schizophrenia. So coming back to my Thursday evenings and seeing this young man, what's going on? Why was I finding nothing for him out there? When if you got a bit of anxiety, the world's your oyster in terms of technology. So there are a few things that have been tried. The most basic thing are texted reminders, prompts, hey, your appointment's tomorrow, that kind of thing, symptom trackers. People have tried to use SMS texting to engage people. Jess Darcy, who's a grad student at UTSC, University of Toronto Scarborough, is working with me. She did a randomized trial of a texting intervention in early psychosis, Slate Center at CAMH. And she found that it was feasible, it worked, it engaged people, and people found it helpful. An interesting side finding of it was that, and there's a lot to unpack here, is that these are all young people who were texted, they had a text-based engagement with their providers, tended to turn up for appointments a little less often. Probably they had a bit of the sense of, hey, we've checked in, I've let you know how I'm doing. I don't think I need necessarily to schlep downtown and talk to you about it. That's the guess. But nonetheless, it works, it engages people. And I mentioned the memory and attention challenges that can be there with schizophrenia is people need this a bit. I probably need this a bit. So next on, there are a couple of apps or smartphone-based technologies, and I'll spend a lot of time on ours, but I'll talk about some of the others. There's an app called Focus, or Thrive is another name it's given. A huge company in the States, a digital health company called Pear Therapeutics, which does a lot of mental health. They have done some trials of this app, found it feasible, looks like it has some decent outcomes. The things aren't totally sold there. They've had implementation problems in trying to bring it to the real world, which I'll get into, but nonetheless, it has CBT based messages. It helps people with reminders and appointments, helps people connect with clinicians. That's the intent, and they've done a decent job. There's an app out of University of California, San Francisco. It's connected somewhat with Google, called Prime. Prime is a little different. Prime is mostly meant to help engage people with real-time providers. So you can kind of connect with your counselor, with your clinician at any time through your phone. And they have some okay evidence for that too. But what I'm going to get into next is our story, App for Independence, or A4I. And this is, not to say that we're the end all and be all here. There's certainly people working in this space, but hopefully this is a narrative or a story that helps to elucidate and illustrate, what it's like to try and build a technology like that. So, I see Gloria, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to ask about the people with schizophrenia who feel the devices are bugged and won't use them. I imagine you've come across that, but it may not be as often as I think it is. But they feel they're being watched through the devices. The conspiracy is using the device to keep track of them, so they won't use them.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a proportion of people, and I can't pin it down to what proportion of people that might, have that impression. I think it's much less. I think in part it's because most people have phones and have kind of become, even if you have schizophrenia, inundated and aware that our devices are watching us all the time. It's kind of like we all have they know where we are, and there is this happening routinely. So I think that perception, and I think you're right that there is certainly I'd say arguably a small group of folks that might never want to use a technology like this. But what we've been finding in practice is that the majority are okay with this. And I think a big thing, and I'll get into our process of co-design. We made some choices about how it works, and just really emphasizing transparency as to what it's doing. That's helped us a good deal. But I'd say that maybe 5-10 years ago there was a bit more of that. But now just people have become a little bit inured to, you happen to be doing a bit of online shopping for skis, and then suddenly you're getting emails about skis. I mean, it's like it's become such a common thing that I think it's a little bit less, perhaps.
Maybe.
All right. So what is A4I? I've already mentioned it's a joint venture. And this was new territory for CAMH. In the United States, many universities are much more used to having industry partners and doing this kind of thing, but this was fairly new territory for CAMH. But that's us. And one of the reasons why I liked and I still like working with Memotext is they have a very rigorous approach to building a technology. And so sadly, a majority of apps and technologies, what happens is you get somebody like me that's got a big bunch of ideas. And they say, I've got a great idea. We got to build this thing. Let's do this and let's build it, and then throw it out in the world. And then you hope it works. But the reality is that technology development fails when you do that almost all the time. You've really got to go back to requirements, do intensive engagement with people that are going to use the technology, and iterate continuously. It's a very scientific kind of approach. And that's Memetext's approach, and that's why we engage them, and I liked working with them because it appealed to the scientist side of me. So you spend a lot of time doing your homework, like what's out there already, how is it built, what does it do? We spend a lot of time in focus groups with family members, with care providers of different kinds, with people with different versions of schizophrenia, trying to understand how do they use technology, what are they interested in, what would they use, what wouldn't they use. To your question, Gloria, we had early ideas about doing location tracking. And location tracking, we weren't interested particularly in where people were. We were interested in risk prediction. And the usual thing or a common thing when people are getting unwell is they either completely isolate and don't leave their apartment ever, or they maybe are out at all kinds of hours and times and all over the place. And we thought we could maybe get some risk prediction happening there, but we heard definitively that people did not want a technology like this tracking where they were. So fair enough. And so we did not put that in. And then we worked on building evidence. I'll spend time on that. And then into the dance here, and the challenging dance it is of, you've got to do many things at once at digital health. You need to build evidence that it works and continuously iterate and design. You need to test in real world environments, and you need to commercialize and find paths for getting it out in the world. And you need to do all of this without going broke, without running out of money. And this is a real challenge, and it is an industry partnership challenge in the sense that, at CAMH as a scientist, I have a salary, and I turn up for work, I get paid. When you're an industry, a private sector industry, when revenues aren't coming in from whatever you're doing, you've got staff you can't pay. And, probably most of you on the call work in the private sector, you kind of are very aware of this. So it creates a challenge where, because it takes time to build these things, and you have lags between, perhaps getting some funds from some place or another, is you can run out of gas. And this is what happens a lot in digital technology development. There are many great companies with smart people that run out of funds, and they have to stop. And so this is the dance that you need to do in building these technologies. So I'll get into a little bit about how A4R, our technology works, but we needed to address a bunch of things. One of which is you can have two people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia that don't remotely resemble one another. They can have completely different symptom profiles. It's a very diverse illness. There's actually a very active debate that's still happening about whether schizophrenia is even one thing, or whether it's a label for many different illnesses. And so I won't get into that, but what the implications for a technology is, you need to tailor what you're building to the person. And you could have a person that maybe their medications are more effective, and they don't have any delusions or hallucinations, but they might be anxious, and they might be a bit depressed. They might have some cognitive challenges. It could be a mixed bag. So you need a simple intake portal. People aren't going to spend forever filling out surveys, and clinicians certainly don't have time to do a lengthy intake piece. You need to do a bit of assessing on the front end to figure out, what do you want to push towards the person that's relevant? If a person doesn't have hallucinations and they're getting all kinds of hallucination information, they're going to pretty quickly get disinterested. And the buckets that we came out in terms of content, and I'll show you how for why it works in a second. Social activation, what engages people socially, living with schizophrenia, by that I mean positive symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, and the like, stress and anxiety, motivation and cognition, ADLs, so just kind of the basic looking after yourself stuff. And we built, and this is purely a request of people with schizophrenia, a peer-to-peer feed. And people wanted to connect with one another in a community. And this isn't about recreating Facebook or anything. What people wanted was a space to share strategies and what was helping people get by. So a very specific way of engaging, and to have it a safe space, moderated, anonymous, safe. And then in here as well is we're trying to, on the back end, do subjective data. You can check in with people. Hey, how was your sleep? How was your mental health? But you also want to be able to track more objective data. And so we've developed to gather sleep data. Most of us, for better or worse, and it's probably mostly worse, we're fiddling around with our phones when we're awake, right? So if you use your phone at all, that tends to mean you're awake. When you don't, it tends to mean you're asleep. So that's one way of assessing sleep in a light touch kind of way. And also, can we use this technology to get a sense of when people are doing unwell, whether it's responding to surveys or indications such as bad sleep, for example, that something's going sideways? Because in the end, it would be a fabulous success if this technology prevented people getting to police at the door and extreme emergency situations. And perhaps maybe a few weeks before that, there was an opportunity to flag something for a family member or clinician when something different might have happened. So that's kind of what the goal is. And that's fundamentally how it was built. So I think this should work. So this is what it looks like on your phone. It looks like a lot of technologies. It basically works on a feed. So the feed, every day you get a certain number of these feed items that pop up on your phone. One part's social and peer generated. So just general interest, as well as you can throw in pictures, you can throw in messages. You have an anonymous avatar there so that you can share things without sharing your identity. But this is something that keeps it alive, because I mentioned one of the biggest challenges in this area is engagement, and it's got to be engaging or people will drop it. And then we've got CBT-based posts as well that are tailored to the person. We've got, I'll pause, it's going quicker than I'm talking. An auditory hallucination detector. This is riffing on that my Thursday nights with that guy, that client that I was seeing, where basically it shows you the ambient sound in your environment and allows you to make a call. Does it seem to be hallucination? Is my brother yelling in the next room? And then you can rate how you did and get some skills related to dealing with coping with hallucinations. It's kind of what it looks like. A lot of medication event reminders, texting, SMS, all this to check in, to help people structure their day and structure their commitments and appointments. And that pops up in the feed as well. And these come up as text-based reminders too. So it's pretty alive when you're using it. It does check-ins. So it asks about very basic, how was your mental health today? How was your sleep last night? You can track your goals. You can set some basic goals, the kind of things like, I'm going to get out see my sister a couple times this week, that kind of goal, and track how you did with your goals. And they pop up. And all of this on the back end is gathered, and you can look at, how have I been doing this month? And you can kind of see how you're doing with goal tracking and sleep and mood. We've got a function here that we very informally called notes to my shrink. We all have that thing where you want to tell your case manager, physician something, but then you forget to in the appointment. So this is about saying, in the middle of the month, you might want to say, I got to tell them that my mouth has been dry. I'm not loving this medication. And that goes into the back end of data collection and goes into what the care provider sees around the time of an appointment. And this is where you've got this clinician portal. So clinicians get basically a very graphical summary, digestible in 90 seconds, where they can have a quick look. And before an appointment, like my goal here is to do better than how's your month been. Just have somebody come in and they can say, hey, it looks like a couple of weeks ago your sleep got really choppy, or it looks like you wanted to talk about some conflict you're having with your neighbor. That's what we're hoping. It has a bit of data collection that comes into the clinical environment and helps with care planning and helps with shared decision making. So that's the goal. Our process. So a lot of iteration. We're constantly learning. We're constantly evolving the technology. We went through many stages at early beta tests. We built the beta version. People tried it out, told us this kind of sucks and this doesn't work. And we did a lot of fixing of things. We did a feasibility test that I'll talk about. And then we're on to several arms of further testing. We're doing a randomized controlled trial, and we're going to do more of that, validating, and then all the commercialization activities. And so the good news is, after all this effort in our first test, and this ran, I think, between, was it 2017 and 2019, we had about 40 people use A4I for a month. And we qualitatively, so talking with people, and quantitatively using surveys, we checked out how it went. And the good news is it went well. Hardly anyone dropped off. People enjoyed using it, found it helpful. We found, interestingly, the people had a bit more distress tended to use it a bit more often. Symptoms got better. And you know, people appreciated it. It seems to work. And ironically, perhaps people spoke to it being particularly engaging because many people with psychosis had felt left out of the self-help technology conversation. So it was kind of felt unique. We did get a bit of feedback saying it felt old school. One of the things that you have to grapple with when you work in digital health is we all get used to using technologies that companies like Google and Microsoft and others built, and they had budgets of $20 million. So when you have $20 million, you can build something pretty slick. When you have far, far less than that and you're trying to build a technology, it'll look a little basic. And so people will give you the feedback, oh, this is old school, this is kind of nice, but wow, it's a little basic. And it's like, yeah, well, you know, if we had another $10 million, it would be slick, but this is something you just kind of have to deal with. So we've got a lot of stuff going on. And I mentioned at the very beginning that you kind of need to have, it's a bit like, you know, Cirque du Soleil, when you've got the person there who's got 10 or so plates spinning on sticks. That's sometimes what it feels like trying to do this work. We've got a lot of stuff happening. We've got, on the evidence side, we're doing a randomized trial of A4I through CAMH, but also working with CMHA, Progress Place, whoops, getting ahead of me here. Schizophrenia Society, or sorry, I Am Mental Health. I still think of it as Schizophrenia Society, and other organizations. We are on a pathway for FDA approval, the Federal Drug Administration group in the US. And you might be thinking, what the heck are you doing living in Toronto, and why are you getting something approved by the FDA? And the reason is, if you want to commercialize and build a technology, and you don't have an endless amount of time and a lot of money, you do need to focus on the US. And the reason is that if the US, in terms of building out technologies, is a lot more straightforward. You will have a care provider that might own care or run care for half a dozen hospitals and 50 clinics. And so they'll purchase a technology, pick it up, and implement it across all these settings. And that's really key to scaling out and key to commercializing. If you're in Canada, unfortunately, we were very fortunate to have a public healthcare system. Don't get me wrong. I've worked in Detroit, New Haven, and a bunch of places, and I've seen the problems of the US system. But in Canada, you need to be a digital brush salesperson. Is in Canada, to move these things forward, you need to go to Hospital A and talk to their folks and say, hey, would you like to try this? And suddenly you're into a whole bunch of bureaucracy and contracts and paperwork. And then you go down the road to the next hospital and the next clinic. Is we don't have many organized ways of implementing. And that causes problems for small companies and groups like us, because we don't have time to go from, we'd long perish if we had to kind of go from door to door. So we do focus on the US as a starting point anyways. We're doing clinical validation. So we have A4I being tested in real clinical environments. By that I mean there's not a lot of research staff, not a big trial, all the extra supports of that. And so in Riverside County, California, we've got a bunch of settings picking up A4I and trying it out, iterating, trying to, when you put this in clinicians' hands, how does it work? And we've been finding in California that peer support workers have a critical role in facilitating digital health engagement, because you can't just give clinicians apps. You've got to have somebody there that facilitates engagement, keeps it alive, keeps it moving, and in our case, keeps our feed alive. And so that's been working really well in California. We're also doing this at CAMH. And then we've got some other stuff going on. We've got some patents in related to our auditory hallucination detector, and that's a whole area in and of itself. So you've kind of got to do a whole bunch of stuff and have the business-minded people go doing their thing here, which I am not, and try and build and try and keep alive, as I mentioned. So taking a step way back to the very beginning, the guy on my Thursday nights, the young man, how the heck does he get something like in his hands? And I think I went into this very naive, and it's something my kids say, or used to say anyways, when they're a smidge younger, is 1, 2, skip a few, 99, 100, is a sort of, you have this idea like, oh, we'll just build this thing. And then, some magical stuff happens, and then boom, everyone has it, and you can retire and go home and your job's done. But you can kind of see, hopefully you've got a bit of a picture through this presentation, just the tremendous amount of work. And we might not survive this effort, and we might never get it into the hands of the guy that I worked with, the average person with schizophrenia. But it's a tremendous and quite a long effort to get there. And, kind of think technology, fast, furious, it's going to, bing, bang, boom, it's all going to happen quickly. It's really not that. It's a bit of a grind, and you have to kind of keep at it, keep engaging. And that's what you need to do. And the challenges we face, so I've already mentioned, people need to want to use it. It needs to be relevant. It's got to be nimble. It's got to be nifty. It's got to be cool and useful. And so keeping it engaging and keeping it current. Companies like Apple and this is something on the technology side, I had no idea on the back end. So that Apple is it's like the architecture of a house, and you build these technologies and they are built to plug into that basic architecture. So to make it work on your iPhone, Apple routinely shifts up the architecture of its house. And so what that requires you to do is make major programming changes to make your app still work, because an app you built 3 years ago won't work anymore on iPhones. You've got to constantly update and constantly keep it connected with that. It's got to be easy to use. This is something we work a lot on, is people don't complicated apps and technologies. We all have probably tried these. I've been on, probably recently too, websites on apps, on using different forms of technology that somehow are just really complicated. And you're like, just give up, say, how to hell with this. I don't want to, this is just too much. I'm not interested. So it's got to be simple to use. It's got to work in our case, in clinical environments. It can't be too hard for clinicians to use. It's got to be relevant and immediately useful to clinicians. It's got to integrate with electronic medical records. So it can't be some other technology. I've got to log into another thing and do something over here and then come back to the EMR. It's got to flow into the EMR and be there, and that data's got to capture, has to happen there. I've already mentioned scaling out. You need to prove to people and get people believing what you're building is useful, valuable, and I've already covered the USA Canada thing. And something that people want to invest in, because people want to invest in something like A4I for 2 reasons. One is they want to help people, and 2 is they want to make money. And as much as I've never been in this for money, and it's not what I'm about as a scientist and clinician and stuff, is you can't move forward unless you have funds to do that. And so how do you convince people that this is valuable? And it's a very cautious environment. And by that, I mean, 10 years ago or so, you could go out and say, hey, I've got this app. You wave your arms around and investors would come. But now, because there have been so many failures, now it's very cautious. The investors in this space are very, very careful. They want to see a lot of data, and they don't just believe that just because it looks slick or you've got a charismatic presenter, they don't believe that they'll want to invest in it because it's too high risk. So these are some of the challenges we face. Our biggest challenge is just kind of keeping the show on the road. If some of you, maybe many of you have had the experience of building a small business, and that's really what this is building we're entrepreneurs, really, is we're trying to get this going. You'll know that you live almost week to week with the resources you have it coming in and the work that you're trying to do, in that it's always on the wire, and any moment you run the risk of you fall on your face. And maybe that'll happen, and maybe that's fine, but it is trying to last so that we can prove the case and get this in people's hands. What are the opportunities? I've covered a lot of the challenges. I just wanted to make sure you understood just how challenging this is. The opportunities, this isn't expensive. So unlike the cost of somebody being picked up by the police and brought to an emergency room, spending days, weeks, months in hospital, having somebody do outreach, drive an hour, a clinician drive an hour to meet somebody in their home for an hour in the community, compared to those kinds of very expensive activities, this is peanuts. So the cost of, so, you know, and this is where even if we have a modest impact, I have no illusions that this is going to massively and radically change people's lives. I hope it might for some. I wish it could, but I don't think it will. But if it can make a small difference, because it's so inexpensive, a small difference for many, it's like a public health thing. A small difference for many, many people is really a worthwhile proposition when you compare it to what we do have, which is either lack of access or very expensive services. This is also, it's never meant to be, the be all and end all. I don't think we ever can or we ever should end up in a place where all the contacts with mental health professionals is through technology. I think that's wrong, and it won't be effective. This is a tool of many tools. One tool will be in-person psychotherapy. Another tool will be when somebody's having a crisis, is coming into hospital to get help, to be safe. Another tool will be having families that have good information and are able to support their person, having a decent home, having enough money so that they can live with some dignity. These are all tools we need. This will be one tool, I hope, of many. It's something like a severe mental health challenge like schizophrenia is something that's not solved by one thing. And we have a long history of challenge with that. We've learned after many years that medications aren't enough in and of themselves, for example, to improve a person's quality of life. It does a lot for many, but it's not enough. And that's where we're part of a picture. And we're not just, I should have mentioned earlier, we never intended A4I just to be for schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is where we started, where it's going to be what's called a transdiagnostic, or like a cross-diagnosis tool for severe mental health challenges. So we're on next. We got a grant this winter, and we're beginning a co-design process this summer to tailor A4I for people with opioid addictions. And we're going to expand from there. We're looking at bipolar disorder, severe depression, adults with mild to moderate intellectual disability, adults with autism. We're looking at how a platform like this, which has a lot of general features, can then have specific plug and play sorts of things that a clinician can say, hey, you've got this, that, and the other going on. Here's the version of A4I for you. There you go, off to the races. That's what we want to have happen. This kind of technology can assist with access challenges. Even in a city, but certainly in suburban and rural environments, is getting access to services is a major challenge. And if you don't have a car and all the rest of it, don't have adequate funds, this is an approach that can get supports in people's hands who might not otherwise get access. And we can pay close attention to equity. We're not interested in research, unfortunately. Large amounts of the sample sizes of many clinical trials and much research are middle-aged white men. And that's not representative of, it doesn't adequately cover women, non-gender binary folks, and certainly racialized populations. So we lack information about interventions to a large extent for populations other than middle-aged white men as well. And certainly some pieces cross over, but there are gaps. And that's where we can be intentional about building this with relevance for a diverse population. And the last thing here, these are early days. Like, we can kind of think, oh, technology's been underway for a while, it's been happening, what's going on? But if we were talking about cars, automobiles, I'd say let's say 1926. That's where I'd say we are. We've got some stuff moving, and some people are picking up cars and trying them out. But you know what? They don't work very well yet, and they're not too many people have them, and there's a long way to go. And that's where I think we are, as fast and furious as it can feel in the digital world. We're in early days, I think, in many ways. Some questions that I think are interesting: what works and for whom? This technology, to Gloria's point earlier, this isn't for everyone, and versions of this, there will need to be tailored versions for different people, and who needs what and when. These are all interesting questions, and that's how we can, it's called precision medicine sometimes in the more medical world. But how can we give the right tool at the right time to the right person? And we need data to do that, and I think it's quite doable. Really trying to understand, what are the outcomes of these? Is it better connection with providers? Is it people feeling more empowered and looking after themselves better? Is it getting ahead of risk? I don't know. These are questions that we need to look at. And I've already touched on this being one tool of a bunch of tools that we need to use. And that's the question of where does digital health fit in, and how do we do this? And can we do this in a systematic way? Like it will be really unfortunate if we land in a place where people get digital health technologies who happen to have the luck of being connected with the one social worker or nurse who happens to be keen on this stuff. And we see this all the time in healthcare, unfortunately, where it's not systematic and database. That's where we really want to look at something flags where you understand, here's a person with this going on. All of the evidence suggests that this is probably a good thing to look at, and people can equitably and consistently get access to that. And I think we've all had that experience with providers where you've got a good person, or a good one, as we might call them, right, who gives you access to this, that, and the other and seems really sharp. And then you've got somebody else that seems to miss a lot of stuff and not follow up. So that's where I hope we can, enter into a better quality of care piece with digital health part of it. And so, do all this, some key requirements: co-design, intensive engagement. We have to do this. We need to be talking constantly with patients, with people with lived experience, with family, with providers, with everyone involved to do the build, and really iterate consistently. We need to be very rigorous on ethics and evidence. The evidence bit I've covered a lot. The ethics bit, this is the middle-aged white men comment, is we need to make sure that we're careful that we're building relevant tools. And as well, we're respecting people's privacy, confidentiality, choice, and transparency through this. Like, for example, our technology, we had to have a third party, and it's good we did a third party privacy review, where a company came in, did a careful assessment with technology people that went right down to the coding, and gave us feedback on, where there are challenges and where it looks solid. And we're fortunate we didn't have major challenges, but there certainly were a few tweaks to make. And so we need to be careful about people's data. Again, this is something you probably would have heard about in other contexts. And then those paths to scale. I've talked about the United States, where things are a little more straightforward. In Canada, we've got to do better. We've got to find ways that we can get these technologies in people's hands more consistently and equitably. Oh yeah, so here, I'll send you, if you're interested, if you know some folks with schizophrenia spectrum challenges who meet these criteria, they got a smartphone, they're 18 or older, can speak and read English, are engaged in some kind of patient treatment, they live in Canada, it's pretty broad. You can have a kick at this particular can. We're doing an RCT, I mentioned. You either go into A4I or you get A4I after 6 months, and it'll be lovely if you wanted to kick this around a bit, because we are, I can tell you, it's not a lot of fun running a clinical trial during a pandemic, trying to engage clinicians and people. So if you had a few folks to suggest, that would be great. And I'll kick an email address into the chat in a moment, if you do want to follow up with our RA, lovely person called Tony Rose, who could speak with you if you so choose. So I think, yeah, that's the end of the road here. I will stop sharing. And yeah, so that's the presentation.